Recording here.
Not a problem.
And welcome everybody to another installment of Fantasy Romance February, Pharaoh Feb. Today's guest here at a Free Thinkers Corner is Trish Heinrich. Am I saying that right?
Yes, well
Okay,
done.
thank you, thank you. Trish is an indie author from the Pacific Northwest, a mother, and a total geek. This is not my saying, this is what I'm reading here. When not writing, she can be found sipping copious amounts of coffee while reading and trying to keep her adventurous children occupied. Serpent's Sacrifice is her first published novel and the first book in the Vigilantes series. The other two are Shadow's Torment and Steel's Fate. She's also working on the Ellen Star Girl Adventure, if that's still current, which is a series of young adult pulp novels. Just anybody who is joining us on Facebook Live, just use the chat box for any questions or comments, and I'll relay them to Trish. Anybody in the chat here, just keep your mics off and your video off, and we will just use the chat for any questions. And Trish, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start with on your website, on your website, your books. The header says these aren't your brother's superheroes.
Yes.
What do you mean by that?
So, growing up, I was exposed to a lot of science fiction, pop culture, Star Wars, classic Star Trek, and the 1977 Christopher Reeve Superman movie. And while it was totally acceptable for me to love these things, it was not acceptable, I guess you could say, for me to be a total fan. So when I would ask for action figures, I would get Barbies, which I would then put in perilous situations and like turn into action figures. But comic books consisted of Archie, which was great. I loved Archie, but there were no superhero type things. The toys and all the fandom surrounding that was really kind of a boy thing, is how I was raised. But I grew up loving them and having kind of a secret love for those science fiction and superhero properties. And when I got older, I realized I really, really love this stuff and wanted to make it my own, wanted to see more women in those heroic roles. You know, we have characters like Princess Leia, and every once in a while you might have Wonder Woman, like a Wonder Woman cartoon. This was before the Gal Gadot movie, but I didn't really have a lot of women heroes that I could really look up to. There was a handful, and yet everywhere I looked, there was like, a dozen iterations of Batman and the sixth Spider-Man movie or whatever. And so what I wanted to create the kind of superheroes that I wanted, that I, as a woman, a female fan, have always been looking for. And I also really love romance. I love kissing books, as my daughters like to call them. And that's kind of frowned upon in the fan community. If you're a woman and you like romance in the mix of your science fiction or your superhero stories, you're not a real fan. And I really wanted to challenge those assumptions and write stories for fans like me and write those female heroes that I didn't find as a young adult or even in my 30s. I wanted to kind of give female fans and maybe even some male fans the superheroes they didn't find a lot of. So
you mentioned, and this is in your bio on your website too, you were obsessed with Wonder Woman and Princess Leia, which you mentioned. And then later on, when you were a little older, other female heroes like Buffy and Ripley. So are those the type of movies and shows that you used to watch? And is that how you kind of got your start, which you sort of mentioned, that's how you got your start in writing what you write?
So I definitely grew up with like Princess Leia and Wonder Woman and all of those, but Buffy came much later as an adult. I actually discovered Buffy in syndication. I'm very late to the party when it comes to this kind of stuff. So I discovered Buffy in syndication and immediately fell head over heels in love. And Ripley, actually, it's funny, I never really saw any of the Alien franchise movies. I don't do well with horror. And so my brother was always telling me how scary they were. And so I just kind of stayed away. And then it was probably 5 years ago. I just decided, I was like, I have to know what all the fuss is about, because I am a huge fan of Sarah Connor in the Terminator franchise. I can't get enough of Sarah Connor. She's amazing. And so my husband's like, I really do think you would like it. And I had just watched Fury Road with Charlize Theron and was gaga over that. And he's like, okay, let's just give it a shot. So we watched Aliens, not the first Alien movie, but the second one. And I was just like, oh my God, how have I lived without Ripley all this time? So it's been a progression for me of discovering a lot of female heroes that either flew under my radar when I was much younger, or I was kind of just, I thought, wouldn't really be for me. And so it's a continuous kind of expanding my horizons about female heroes.
Did you ever get back to watching the other Alien movies, the first one and then sequels after that?
Curious about the first one. Actually, I think I might go back and watch that one, but I've had so many friends tell me to stop at 2. They're like, don't do it. Don't watch the other ones.
Yeah.
And I'm like,
Yeah.
I'm good.
Yeah. Definitely one though. That's more of a, I mean, it is scary, but it's suspenseful.
Mhm.
So
And I love suspense. So
nice. So which Wonder Woman is your favorite?
you can't ask that.
And
That's
I
a
grew up
hard
with
one.
I grew up with Linda Carter,
Me
and
too.
I haven't seen any of the other newer ones. So it's, I guess, Wonder Woman to me. When you say that, that's her. That's Wonder Woman, Linda Carter.
Yeah.
What about you?
Well, I grew up with Linda Carter as well. It's kind of funny because I would watch the reruns of the Linda Carter Wonder Woman show, and then immediately I would stay for the Incredible Hulk, which they showed after it, which is just a very weird kind of double superhero punch. But I I think for me, it's really hard to choose because I feel like Gal Gadot really captured the spirit of Wonder Woman, and so Linda Carter for me is my childhood Wonder Woman. She's the Wonder Woman I grew up with and wanted to be when I grew up with, when I grew up. And Gal Gadot is the Wonder Woman for me as a grown woman, as a mom who wants to give my daughters all the female heroes that I feel like was really hard to find when I was growing up.
Right.
And so while Linda Carter, I have always just such a special place in my heart for her, I have gone back and tried to watch the show, and it was a very bad idea. It happened super well. But she was amazing in that part. She was beautiful and smart and brave. And I remember wanting to be that growing up and seeing that kind of strength, but it was also a compassion. Like her compassion and her care for people was also one of her strengths. And I saw Gal Gadot utilize that in the Wonder Woman movie a lot. There is a scene. So I went by myself. It was a mommy date. I took myself out to see the movie opening night. And I'm sitting there in a packed theater in the dark. And there is a scene, it's called No Man's Land. And everybody who's seen the movie knows exactly what I'm talking about. But it's because the movie is set in World War I, Wonder Woman gets caught in the trenches and she doesn't understand, like there's people on the other side that need help. We need to go help them. And Steve's trying to tell her, we can't cross this. This is uncrossable. We have to go around. And she's like, no, these people need help now. So she makes the decision, she's going to cross no man's land to get to this village that needs help. And the entire sequence is incredible. It's quiet, first of all of a sudden this battlefield goes quiet. There's still fighting going on, but they've taken the sound out, and you just see her climb up the ladder, and she's there in the battlefield, and suddenly the bullets start coming, and she takes her bracelets and she starts deflecting them. But then it gets super intense, and she's crossing this field and she's running and she's deflecting the bullets, and you're just like, oh my God. And then all the fire goes to her. So she takes out her shield and she's the only one standing there taking the fire. And I just remember starting to sob. I was bawling. And I felt so dumb. I'm like, I'm bawling during this epic scene. And it took me a day or two to find out I wasn't the only one. There are every time I looked at a post about this movie, I saw women talking about how they cried when they
Mm,
saw that scene, because as women fans, it was this quintessential heroic Wonder Woman moment. She's going to stand there and maybe be the only one standing there, and she's going to take all the fire, and she's going to do what it takes to help that village, to help those people. And it's a moment to this day that will bring me to tears. I mean, it's been years and I still watch it and I still tear up. And so I think it's hard for me to choose, because they each have a special place in my heart, you know,
mm.
as a fan of these stories. So I can't choose.
So are those the type of characters or type of features, the characteristics that you write into your characters in your books?
I try to very much, yes. My first trilogy, in the Vigilantes universe, which is called the Rise of Heroes. Those are the books that you mentioned. My protagonist is a woman. She doesn't have powers. She's more like Batgirl, but she wants to help. She wants to go out there and be brave and do the right thing and fight for, you know, the people that need to be fought for. And I really do try to instill that, you know, there is a measure of compassion. I do have her learning, you know, it's not all about punching and kicking and beating the bad guy that way. Sometimes you can beat the bad guy by helping out those that need your help, you know, fighting the good fight by doing the right thing instead of going and, you know, storming the castle, kind of a thing. And that's part of her arc. And it's also part of her arc to realize that she can't do it by herself, that that asking for help, needing help, doesn't make you weak, that it's actually one of the strongest things that you can do. So I do try to put those kinds of narratives into my stories. And even though I'm not writing a big epic, I would love to someday, but I'm just not there yet. So,
Mhm.
and even in my romance, having those moments of, you know, romance is really all about realizing that you need somebody else to help you heal or to get through it, or to conquer your own inner demons and things like that. And that's not a bad thing. um, that being a hero is about a lot of different things other than like the big flashy moments.
Mhm.
So
So you mentioned Batgirl, and I was going to ask this too. So did you write a little bit, or what are your thoughts on Batgirl and even Supergirl?
I love them. I'm not a big, it's funny, I'm a big superhero fan, but I'm not a big comic book reader. And for whatever reason, it's hard for me to follow a comic book. My girls are great at it. I'm terrible. But I have read some of the few comic books I've read have been Batgirl comics. And I believe it was Gail Simone's run on Batgirl, and I think that was a New 52 run. I read some of those, and I've read some of the Birds of Prey. I haven't read a lot of Supergirl comics. The ones I have picked up, I didn't really like, but I loved the TV show. Oh my gosh, I loved the TV show. Um, and it's the same. It's interesting to me because maybe with the exception of Batgirl, I haven't seen this a lot with Batgirl, but with Supergirl in particular, you did have this narrative of stronger together. That was a huge theme. They said it so many different times, and how she's the strongest person in the room, but she chooses compassion. She tries to think about how to help people rather than just how to punch her way through something. And I so appreciated that. I watched most of the first season of Batwoman and really loved it. And actually, I did read the comic series, the comic run that the first season was based on, with Alice and all of that. And oh my gosh, that is one of the few comic book series that I could not get enough of. Um, I really liked it. I like those darker narratives, oddly enough. Um, I think there's something really compelling about a dark narrative that has these beautiful moments of light in it. that comes from a character growing, that comes from a character's connections with other characters, their relationships, that those are the bright spots in an otherwise kind of dark story. So I really love them. I would love to see a Batgirl television show at some point. That would be a lot of fun.
So how does Princess Leia work into all this as well? Is it her strong female character? Is it the compassion that she has, or the romantic side, and like the Star Wars movies there with Han? What is it that's so appealing about Princess Leia?
All of the above.
Hey,
I think for me, again, kind of like Linda Carter as Wonder Woman, Carrie Fisher as Princess Leia was one of the few female heroes that I had in my life as a child. And although her romance with Han was, mwah, oh, it was everything. It was one of my first crushes was Han Solo. So I am all in for that any day of the week. But it wasn't her complete identity. She was a leader. And there's this moment in Empire Strikes Back that at the time when I saw it as a kid, I didn't quite understand why it was like, wow, look at her do that. But as an adult, I get it. So they're at Hoth base and they're getting ready to evacuate. And Princess Leia, and like Carrie Fisher is so short and wonderful. Like she's just this little tiny woman. And she's surrounded by these tall pilots. And they're all looking to her for command. And she's telling them with confidence, there is nothing in her demeanor that says I shouldn't be doing this or I can't be doing this. With full confidence, she is giving them orders. Mm-hmm. And she's telling them to carry out those orders. And if you think about it, in particularly sci-fi in the 70s and 80s, and also looking at pulp sci-fi stories, which Star Wars just draw from it to some extent, that's not usual. We don't see women do that. We see men do that. We don't see women do that. She commanded armies. She stood up to Darth Vader. She endured torture. She lost everything and still continued to fight. When Han and Luke couldn't figure out how to get out of the prison, sector, she blew a hole in the trash, section and was like, come on, you guys aren't going to do it. Somebody's got to.
right.
And then in the newer movies, we see she's become a general. You know what I mean? Like, yeah. And it was this great meme that I saw, and it was Buttercup on one side, and then Antiope. So Robin Wright played Buttercup, and she also played Antiope in the Wonder Woman movies. And then it was Princess Leia and then General Leia. And it was, I've grown up, I've lived long enough to see my childhood princesses become generals. And it was just this moment of, yeah, that's it. And that's what I want to see. That's what I want to try to contribute to, is giving people these narratives of seeing women in heroic roles like that. And so, yeah, everything about Leia, oh my God.
That and taking on a big, huge slug.
Exactly. She strangled Jabba the Hutt. It was wonderful.
So the romantic aspect of your books, what kind of characters? I'm thinking probably Buffy. Well, I mean, besides her being just a kick butt vampire killer, but she still had that it's been so long since I've seen the Buffy TV show. There was Sarah Michelle Gellar, but my wife is a huge fan of that one. Boreanaz there, so they sort of had that love-hate thing kind of going on.
Yeah.
Where did you get your romance inspiration from? What characters?
Oh my. Well, I grew up on romantic comedies, and actually I grew up on very old-timey romantic movies. My mom was a huge classic movie buff, so we would sit down and I've been devouring romance films since I was 7 or 8, to be honest. And I went through this time as a creator where I really tried to hide that part of my creativity, because superhero fiction is a male dominated genre. It on Amazon, it's categorized as part of fantasy, but really it's more of an offshoot of science fiction. And sci-fi in general is a very male-dominated genre. And as a woman, I really wanted to um, be accepted is probably the wrong way to put it, but I mean, it's the only way I
Mhm.
can think of it is I wanted to be accepted with my male colleagues. And to do that, I felt like I really had to downplay my love for romance as either a subplot or the main plot. And so I really tried to downplay that. In the first trilogy in particular, there is a romantic subplot, but I didn't go as far as I wanted to with that. And then I realized last summer I went through a rebranding of my author business. All of the books got brand new covers. My website got redesigned, all of it. And my friend that was helping me with this, he's like, you know, what do you want your brand to be? It's not very clear. What kind of author do you want to be? And as we were talking, he's like, I think you should try romance. You clearly have a love for this. And it was then that I really realized, okay, I'm suppressing this part of my storytelling self, and I really need to unpack it. Now that I started to think about it, I was all of the superhero stories that I absolutely love, they have this very strong romantic element. So Arrow, the CW show, Felicity Smoke and Oliver Queen, I think is one of the most fantastic romantic relationships in the entire CW universe. Maybe all of the movies and TV shows of the last 20 years actually that have superheroes. I love it. Supergirl, I loved her and Jimmy Olsen. I know they didn't keep them together very long, but I thought it was brilliant. Um, I love romantic pairings that are a meeting of equals. And so you mentioned Buffy and Angel. That was a meeting of equals. As much as he did care about her, he recognized she's just as strong or stronger than I am. She can hold her own in a fight. You know, Angel had her back
Mhm.
a lot, but I don't remember one time where he subverted her agency or her ability to lead or her ability to fight. And I love romantic relationships like that. I feel like Oliver and Felicity were like that. I feel like Monel and Supergirl were like that. Um, I think for me, that is like the basic standard of when I go and write a romantic relationship. It's I want them to be equals with each other. I want them to have that respect for one another. So for me, that's the basic inspiration.
So with this genre being difficult to get into or to be recognized for, Pharaoh Feb must be a a wonderful thing to be able to bring out this side of fantasy and with the romance side as well. I've mentioned this in most of the talks that I've done throughout the month, that I'm a fantasy buff, I'm a sci-fi buff, not really a romance buff. When I think romance, I think uh, I'll say it again, Fabio on the white horse, on the beach there.
Yeah.
But talking and listening and talking with the other authors, a lot of the fantasy, what I consider fantasy books, but like the Twilight series, like Laurel
Mhm.
K. Hamilton. I mean, I haven't read a lot, so I'm saying the same ones that I've been saying through the whole thing, but those would be considered, I guess, fantasy
Yeah.
romance.
Mhm.
Um, so thanks to H.R. Moore, Harriet, for putting this together. Do you think
Absolutely.
it is getting more exposure, not just from Pharaoh Feb, but just in general? Do you think the fantasy romance genre or subgenre is getting more exposure than when you first started?
I think so. Yes. I think my tiny corner of it, which would be superheroes, I'm seeing more and more superhero romance authors. It's funny. I help run a discovery website with a co-author of mine, superherofiction.com, and we we have almost 500 books on that website, and we curate it very heavily. So it's all superhero books. And our romance, we have it divided by the genre within the superhero genre, so like all the subgenres. And the romance section is growing. Every month we get a new romance author, we get a new romance book. And I think that more and more people are starting to see superhero romance as a part of fantasy or a part of science fiction. A lot of times it lines up very well with paranormal romance. which is of course a subset, a subgenre of fantasy. So I feel like there is a lot more people discovering it every month, and I'm certainly discovering more authors that are writing in superheroes and romance all the time.
Your according to your website, your bio there, you started writing in 2015, and you
Mhm.
started with the NaNoWriMo, the National Novel
Yes.
Writing Month. Um, I'm glad it was spelled out on your website because I always forget what NaNoWriMo stands for. I didn't know about it till just actually, yeah, about a year or so ago. But I tried my hand at it. I got 30 words in 30 days. But
Hey, that's something.
so what was that like doing that? How did that really start kick off your writing career?
Oh my gosh. Well, so I had my husband. I was an actress before I became an author, and it's a very long story. But my husband and I, and our producing partner, our production company, kind of just floundered. Uh, and I didn't want to start all over again as an actress. I had had two kids, and so I had been out of the audition pool for about 4 years, which is an eternity when you're an actor. And I needed an outlet. And as a kid, I was always writing. I was writing Nancy Drew fan fiction before I even knew what that was. You know, like my parents had TV boxes of my notebooks filled with really, really bad stories. And so I thought, you know what? I needed a creative outlet. My oldest was going to start kindergarten, or was in kindergarten, in September of that year. And I talked to my husband and I said, I think I want to give this a shot. And he said, okay. He said, let's do it. What do you need from me? And at the time, my youngest was still in diapers. And like I said, my oldest was going to kindergarten. And so there wasn't a ton of time, but I was going to get some during the day. And I said, well, I'm going to need help getting writing time. And so we figured out, I decided to do NaNoWriMo, by the way, October like 5th or something like that. And NaNoWriMo starts on November 1st. So I had less than a month. I was like, let's just do this. And so I had to figure out, I had a couple of story ideas banging around in my head, and I just chose the one I thought would be the easiest because it didn't really require world building. And it turned out to be the very rough and very, very rough draft of Serpent's Return. And what ended up happening is I would write during naps. So my youngest was still napping in the afternoon. I would give myself a very short lunch break, and then I'd go upstairs and I'd write for an hour, maybe hour and a half if she slept really well. And then 2 or 3 nights a week, my husband would come home and I would have made dinner for the kids. And so he's like, okay, I'll take over with them. And I would go upstairs and I would write for 2 hours while he put the kids to bed and made us something to eat. And then on the weekends, Saturday and Sunday, he was home. And so I would write for 3 or 4 hours each of those days. And it ended up by the end of the month, I had written 90,000 words. And it was an incomprehensible first draft. The villain changed 3 times through the course of the writing. It did not end up where I thought it was going to end up. I would say over 50% of it ended up in the waste bin when I revised it. But you can't revise a blank page. It got me started. It kind of uncorked all this pent up creative energy. And I realized this is what I want to do. And so my husband and I talked about it, and we talked about traditionally published versus independently published. And the research that I had been doing, the people that I had met at different conventions, I realized pretty quickly I wanted to go indie. And for me, that wasn't a big leap because my husband and I had been independent actors and producers for years before then. Um, so I had a good idea of kind of what I was getting myself into in terms of being indie like that. And I knew one thing for certain: if I couldn't market it, there was no point. If you can't sell it, there's no point. You've got to be able to sell your product as a business owner. And so that was the big piece of it for me. And as I revised this really bad first draft and learned how to do that at the same time, I was also devouring podcasts and ebooks and webinars and cheap classes from indie authors about marketing. How was I supposed to do all of this? And I ended up publishing, I believe I said, was it 2017? I think was when I published Serpent's Return. I think it's all the years they run together, especially when you have kids.
Yes, I know.
Yeah. And I'd kind of taught myself. I taught myself how to market. I taught myself all the little bits and bobbles that I needed to get started. And, looking back, there was a lot of things that I did wrong. There was a ton of things I did wrong that had to be corrected, that I know better now. But I went forward with the knowledge that I had, and just kind of took a leap of faith. But if I hadn't done NaNoWriMo, I never would have gotten started. Never. That would have never happened for me. So it's safe to say it literally changed my life doing that, writing that really crappy first draft in November.
So you also wrote short film scripts. So this must go along with your acting and your producing and everything. What's the well? Is there anything out there that we could see, that we could find to watch or read?
So one of the only script that I wrote entirely by myself, we didn't get it produced. We were trying to find funding for it, but I was pregnant with my second child. It was a very difficult pregnancy, and so that just didn't happen. But um, our production company, the last one that we had, did put together a web series. I was one of the co-creators, and I was a script consultant on the episodes, and I also acted in it. And it's called The Collectibles. And it is the Super Friends meets The Office. So it's a group of superheroes that work in an office setting, and you never see them go out on missions, but you see the aftermath of the missions. You see the office politics, you see the squabbling, the leveraging for sponsors, and we had some real life sponsors that we put in the show as sponsors of some of the superheroes. It was pretty funny. That lasted one season, and one of the reasons is because I had gotten pregnant right after the premiere, and I was trying to market it, but I was so sick throughout like the first bit of my pregnancy, I wasn't able to get out there. And then the momentum kind of fell through. But to this day, we still have people emailing us. We still have fans contacting us asking for a second season. And it was, oh God, my youngest is 8. So that was 9 years ago. And it will always have a special place in my heart. I will always be so proud of what we did, because it really was a labor of love. You can find it on YouTube. All of the episodes are up. We even, our art department made custom action figures for each of us that were superheroes. And so there's like these vintage 80s toy commercials at the beginning of each episode with our action figures. So it was really fun. If you like superheroes, you like awkward comedy, it's a great, like, fun, short little show.
So did any of that comedy work its way into your current novels?
The romance novels I'm working on right now, because I am working on the previous books I published are under T.L. Heinrich, and then I'm doing a more romance forward series under Trish Heinrich, and so those are going to have a little bit more humor in them. The books that are out right now, there's a little bit here and there, but it's pretty serious and pretty dark. And the first trilogy in particular, the villain is a pretty dark villain. And the second trilogy, which the final book in that will come out in October, there's racial politics and things like that are in it that lend it a little bit to the darker part of it, our darker side of things, because, and this is one thing I do regret, because it makes it very difficult sometimes to write and to market. These original trilogies are set in the past, so it's an alternate history. It's set in the early 1960s, and so some people look at that and they say, "Oh, it's an alt history book," and it's really not. It doesn't really fit alt history. It is superheroes, but I put it in the past because I just wanted to. I didn't really think it through. So there are some things that are a little dark in those, and might be some funny moments, but not a whole lot, unfortunately.
Which
Sorry,
did you
that was a
find?
roundabout question. Roundabout answer.
Which did you find more difficult, writing the screenplays or writing your novels? Or is it just they're just two different things that it takes a different kind of skill set to.
Um, I think they're both, for me anyway, they're both equally difficult, but I prefer novels. With a screenplay, I would either put too much in or not enough. Like there's a really delicate balance between the dialogue and the direction that you're giving, because you can't lay it all out. I mean, really, the vision of the film, you're giving them a roadmap when you write a screenplay. The vision of the film is determined by the director, really. But you have to give enough of a roadmap for the director to get there. So it's a delicate balancing act. But also with novels, you don't want to overwrite them. You know, you don't want to like 5 pages description of a brick building because that's really boring. But for me personally, my style of storytelling, I prefer novels to screenplays. But I do, when I was acting, I loved being a part of the filmmaking process. I was actually going to start trying my hand at directing before I pivoted towards becoming an independent author. So there's good and there's good and there's bad in both ways of storytelling for me.
So a while ago, you had mentioned world building, and it was something that I never even really thought of asking out of the couple dozen of these that I've done since last summer, until I think Harriet had something on the library one that
Mhm.
I moderated the other day with the Portsmouth Library. She had asked a question about world building, so I'm starting to ask that. Talk about your first series, the Serpent's Return, and how you built that world. What is it modeled after a particular like Gotham City or something, or and then you also mentioned it's in the past, it's historical. How much research did you have to do? How much historical fiction? How much fact is
Mhm.
in that world that you created for your book?
So, in terms of the city, when I was writing it, I was still living in Seattle, and I love Seattle. It's changed a lot, but I really loved it, and so I wanted. I'm I'm really bad at, like, I haven't been to a place and now I've got to write about it. I just, plus I had little kids, so I thought, okay, I'm going to write what I know, but I'm going to make it a fictional version of what I know. So I kind of combined Seattle and Tacoma, um, and made Jet City. Um, because and I love the name now, but at the time it was a placeholder because I'm super bad at naming things. Like I went on to NaNoWriMo forums. I'm like, I need help naming a city in a comic book novel. And no, none of us really came up with anything that resonated with me. So I was like, well, I'll just call it Jet City. And it works. I really like it actually now. Um, but I took parts of Seattle and Tacoma and I put them in the book, and I had a layout in my head about how I wanted the northern part of the city to be, and the middle part of the city, and what the south part of the city is. And because the first book starts off briefly in the main character's childhood, and she grows up in the southern kind of area of the big city, and it's run down, and it's just it's kind of a poorer part of the city. And where I was living at the time used to be that way. It had been gentrified a lot, and I was seeing a lot of people get pushed out that had been there for decades and generations. They had carved out this life for themselves, but because the area was being gentrified, they couldn't afford it anymore. And so I put some of that in the book as well. That comes out more in the third book, in terms of like the main character trying to help people and things like that. So there were parts like that I just kind of I put into my world building of the city. And then I also had to think about, and this was something I didn't think about at first, but um, when my husband read the book, because he reads all of my stuff, he's like, have you decided where superpowers have come from? And I was like, let me get back to you. Um, Got to think about that one. And so I did, and that really helped. Like it actually helped flesh out the portion with the kids, because her and her childhood friends developed superpowers and as children, and that comes out later in the book. So it was slow, it was layered. It was, okay, I'm going to tackle how I want the city to look. And I would look on Pinterest for vintage photos of Seattle and Tacoma, And I would extrapolate that for the feel of the time. So the book starts in 1947, but it's just the first couple of chapters, and then it zooms up to the 1960s. And so I looked at photos of certain neighborhoods in the 40s, and then I looked at photos of different buildings and places in the 60s in Seattle to get a flavor for how did things look, how did people dress. And honestly, I spent most of my time researching fashion because, and I don't know why I went down the dark rabbit hole of, full skirts versus pencil skirts. When did that happen? That kind of thing. But to me, that felt like a really important touchstone was what people were wearing. I think that I don't know why visually to me, I think of the 60s and I can see fashion, that really defines the era. So I did that. I did all of that research. And in my second trilogy, the one that's finishing up in October, I base that in New York, particularly Harlem. And so I never been to Harlem. And so I actually did a lot more research, reading books, and looking at a lot of photographs, looking at some historical texts and things like that about the Harlem Renaissance and what it was like, and just the racial politics in Harlem in the 60s, to see how much of this do I want to use, because the 60s was an incredibly volatile period in America. And so I had to take a look at how much of this is going to work in my world and how much of it is just going to bog everything down and make it overly complicated. So I don't really have the Vietnam War. This next book is going to come right up to the time before the Kennedy assassination, and I'm not sure in other series in the Vigilantes universe at this time if I'm going to do that or not. I haven't decided. But to me, the historical aspects, since it's alternative history and I feel like I can play with it a little bit, I determine what to include by, is it going to add to the narrative? Is it going to add to the world? Is it going to add something to the story? Or is it going to bog it down? And if it's going to bog it down, I generally just push it to the side and decide as I go, if it's going to fit. And if it doesn't, I just don't go back to it. That's how I do it. I know I have a friend that has an alt history superhero trilogy that he did it very differently. He included those things, but he asked the question, what would happen if my character did this? How would that affect this part of history? I didn't really ask those questions. I just chose not to. So that's how I did my world building. It was kind of just, at first I kind of didn't really know what I was doing, and then I found my way of doing it, which I think is probably what every author does.
How do you keep it from becoming, and I guess especially, well, maybe not especially, but with superhero novels, because you think, like you were talking about the clothing. I think Batman. You get the trench coats and the derbies, and
Yeah.
that 50s 60s look, but that's kind of the feel, and then the dark streets, the rundown. You mentioned that, the rundown. How do you keep it? Is it by looking at different pictures from different eras that you were talking about, mushing them together to keep it fresh versus being stereotypical or cliche?
That's a great question. The first trilogy I wrote, I agonized over how often I used fire escapes and alleyways in particular. Because I didn't want to be cliche and I didn't want to be tropey. But now that's iconic. And some superhero friends, author friends, and I were talking the other night, and we were just like, how many of you guys have fire escapes? And everybody's like, yep. And it's one of those iconic tropes that, yes, it's overused. And yes, if you use it too much in your book, people are going to start to kind of roll their eyes and be like, how many fire escapes are really in this city? But I don't worry about it so much anymore. I have a very good editor that actually will call me out on, okay, this is the 7th alley they've been fighting in. Can we find a different location? And so I will do that. If it's becoming tiresome, it's like, all right, yeah, I need to shake it up. But I no longer worry about it in terms of cliche or anything like that, because there's some of the trappings of the genre. I mean, you can argue that Iron Man doesn't really technically have a dual identity because everybody knows Tony Stark is Iron Man, but he kind of does have a dual identity because he's Iron Man and Tony Stark. And, there are things like that where it's like, it's expected. If you write a superhero novel, people are either going to have powers or tech that gives them extra abilities, or they're going to be a costume vigilante like Batman and Batgirl. Like there are tropes within the genre. So I guess I just don't worry about it much anymore. I try to find a uniqueness there. How am I going to use the alley that might be a little bit different than I used it last time? Like I actually used a fire escape to almost kill one of my characters, like was this very dramatic moment. And then I gave her kind of some PTSD around fire escapes because I thought, well, if you almost die on one, you're not really going to want to be on one anymore. And so it was like this very kind of like emotional thing with her on a fire escape. And I thought, well, that's different. I don't think I've ever seen that before. So there are things like that, but I really don't worry about it too much anymore, unless my editor calls me out on it.
Did you ever have to kill off a character that you really didn't want to, but it just either the story, and we'll get to this, how you build the story, but the story kind of led in that direction, or it was planned out that, at some point this character just has to go for whatever reason for the drama of the story, or, okay, I'm tired of this character. Have you ever had to do that, but it's one of your favorite characters, but you just know you have to end it?
So yes, there is a character in the first trilogy. I knew that she needed to die. I felt like that anyway. My husband argues with me a little bit about this one. That's okay. He can argue with me about it. It's fine. It was, I don't want to do spoilers, but I really was heartbroken. I cried when I wrote her death scene, because I adored this character. It's a type of character that you really don't get to see very often in any kind of media, especially in a hero narrative. She's not one of the main. She's like she's a supporting character. Um, and when I realized she had to die, I tried to figure out. I tried to write around it. I tried to avoid it. It was like there is no avoiding it. This has to happen. And it's a great moment. It's kind of one of those scenes that I go back and I read and I'm like, wow, this is a good scene. Like, pat myself on the back. And then there was another character in the same trilogy that, I mean, and I can talk about this. It was one of the three main characters. So there's Alice, who's my main character. She's Serpent. Marco is Shadow Master, and Lionel is Steel. And I originally had in the third book that Steel would die at the end. And I thought this is good. This is necessary. It'll be fine. And then I ended up relaunching that trilogy to correct some mistakes. I had poor editing on those three books, so I pulled them off the market, re-edited them, and actually and my friend told me, he's like, this is your chance. If there's anything you don't like about these books, you can rewrite them. And I thought, okay, that death is one I don't like anymore. I'm going to rewrite it. So I actually brought him. I rewrote the end of that book so that he didn't die. And I'm really grateful for that. There are so many people that are like, oh, I'm so glad you didn't kill him. That would have been terrible. And I was like, dodged a bullet on that one. And he's actually going to get his own series. It's going to be kind of an Indiana Jones meets Warehouse 13 meets superheroes kind of globe-trotting adventure series. So that's two ends of the spectrum, a character that, yes, needed to die, and I still stand by that. And another one where I'm like, nope, that has to change.
Well, and then further down at one end of the spectrum, the other end of the spectrum is there a character that you've written that just won't die? And I don't mean it's one of those cliche things where he just sort of somehow gets away. It's just, you just find that this character just, okay, one more chapter with him in it, or one more book with him in it, or her in it. And it's just, and you don't like the character, but the character just has to appear for whatever reason.
I don't have one that I don't like that does, not yet anyway. I'm sure that will happen. But there is a character in Shadow's Torment. Her name is Colleen Knight, and she was supposed to be a one-off, honestly. So Shadow's Torment is a little bit, it's kind of a different book in the middle of the trilogy. It's more of a noir detective superhero story. So she's kind of his Girl Friday character. And I did not intend, first of all, to give her a point of view, make her a point of view character in the book. But as I'm writing it, she kept popping up and insisting that she was a point of view character. So I was like, okay, fine. I'll make you a point of view character. I'll give you an arc. Okay, we're good now. And fans loved her. They loved her. They were like, did we get to see more Colleen? What happens to Colleen? And I was like, okay, well, now I got to figure that out. So I wrote a story for her, which is, she's the main character in this second trilogy. And I realized, wow, I really do like writing her. And there's a really good story here. There's a really good story of reconciliation, like family reconciliation, of owning your power, because she has pyrokinesis, but she has a really hard time controlling it. So she's afraid of herself. In particularly in Shadow's Torment, she's really scared of her powers, but she also is from an abusive family and is kind of forced back into contact with that family because she's trying to save her brother. And so her trilogy is exploring the healing of her family, and owning her power and finding out who she is and what does she want out of life. And I never intended that to happen. Like I said, she wasn't even supposed to be a point of view character. She was supposed to kind of be the His Girl Friday and then just kind of go away halfway through the book, honestly. But she hung around, and now she has her own series. So, I that definitely has happened.
So you write these spin-off series. You have some novellas as well that you've written. Have you ever
Mhm.
thought about turning? You mentioned you're not a big comic book reader or graphic
Yeah.
novel reader, but have you ever thought of maybe turning one of your characters or one of your books into a graphic novel or a comic book?
When the first trilogy first came out, I tossed it around a little bit because I have some friends that are independent comic artists. Um, but I just it if one of them came to me and said, "Hey, I'd love to turn this into a graphic novel," I wouldn't say no, but it's not something that I'm really pursuing. It's such a different market, honestly. Comic readers and superhero novel readers, you would think that they would cross over, but they don't a lot of the time. A lot of the time, novel readers for superheroes are like me, where they just can't get into comics, and comic book readers really don't want a prose version of the story. They want, the panel type of story setup. So it's something that I wouldn't say no to, but it's not something I'm really looking for right now.
So we know in your novels you have a lot of the female super character superheroes
Mhm.
from your past and present had a lot of influence on it. What about other things like music or games, um, that involve superheroes or not? What kind of music do you like? Has that any influence on your characters or even world building?
I love listening to music while I write. I listen to a lot of soundtracks, superhero soundtracks, epic fantasy soundtracks. I think Lord of the Rings is one of my all-time favorites. Um, the one that I discovered about a year ago was Sense 8, which is a really amazing, non-traditional, deconstructed kind of series about superheroes on Netflix. And the soundtrack from that show is phenomenal. I love it. I will oftentimes, like, if my romance books are going to be very steamy, and so if I'm writing a love scene, I will craft like a playlist for that couple, songs that I feel like are about them. I've started doing that quite a bit, actually, as crafting uh, playlists on Spotify for each of my books. I also like, when I'm writing a fight scene, I like really fast, quick kind of music. I really like a lot of heavy like guitar music, and so or like uh, female rock voices, so like Evanescence and Florence and the Machine and Billie Eilish, and and those types. I'll put together a playlist that's some of their faster music for some fight scenes that I'm trying to write. So music is definitely a help and an inspiration. I've tried writing without it, and I get, oddly enough, I get distracted. It's like I can't focus. And music makes me feel like I'm in this bubble, and I can just zone in. So definitely music. Video games. I loved video games as a kid and a young adult. In particularly, I loved Mortal Kombat and Street Fighter, which no surprise that I have like fight scenes in my books. I could never get into things like Donkey Kong or Super Mario Brothers. I hated those games. But like the fighting games, so Injustice, the DC game Injustice for the Xbox, like I love that game. But they didn't really influence it as much as I can see a kind of a connection between like, yeah, I like to write fight scenes and I like to rip out people's spinal cords in Mortal Kombat. So
Well, if you ever need some epic female fronted fantastic European heavy metal bands to,
ooh.
Within Temptation, my favorite.
Oh, I love them.
Oh,
Yes, they're really epic. Their
yep,
sound is super epic. Yes.
yep. They're my favorites. Of course, Evanescence you mentioned, Epica, Nightwish.
Oh,
Um,
I gotta write this down.
there's
Nightwish.
Nightwish. Some of their older stuff very symphonic,
Ooh.
operatic, but just very epic music. That was their first singer. Their second singer, more of a rock, but still has a lot of keyboard. Actually, one of their albums was what do you call them, a storytelling type album. What do you call that? I can't think of what
Like
it's
with a
called.
spoken word or
No, I'll think of it later. But it has the entire album had a storyline to it.
oh,
Um,
nice.
so
Okay.
it's really really good. But yeah, Nightwish is a good one. Epica, Within Temptation, those are all good ones to.
I love Within Temptation. The first time I ever heard them, I thought it was Evanescence. They're such a similar sound.
Mhm.
And then when I realized they weren't, I was like, oh, a new band to explore.
Yep, yep. So you mentioned that uh, um you were gonna kind of get the romance a little bit more steamy there, and you mentioned that your husband
Uh-huh.
reads your books. Do you? I don't know how old your daughters are, but do you let them read your books?
No.
No.
They are 11 and 8 right now, and they really want to. They see my books. In fact, my oldest tried to sneak one of my books off the bookshelf, and I was like, put it back. Um, the T.L. Heinrich books, there is a little bit of sex in there. Not, it's a fade to black. I don't go really super explicit. It stays just on the line between clean and steamy. Um, but there is enough violence in there. There are some images that are, I mean, I'm not going to lie, there's a couple of kind of disturbing little things that happen in there. Uh, it's just not for kids. I've had a lot of people say teenagers is a good, depending on what you're comfortable with your teenager reading, I would say 15, 16-year-old. I did have somebody purchase my books for the middle school library that they worked at. And I was like, okay. I was really nervous about that one. Not my romance books, my T.L. Heinrich books. But I'm do not let my girls read it at all. And actually my husband, for my books under T.L. Heinrich, he's my developmental editor, which I know they tell you, don't let your husband or like your best friend read it because they'll just tell you it's fabulous. But that's not the relationship my husband and I have. We've been working creatives with each other, or the whole time we've known each other for 20 years now. And he's very honest with me. And sometimes I really don't like it. And I'll have to go away and process what he said. So it's actually a very good working relationship. And he's like a bloodhound when it comes to plot holes and things like that. And so I want him reading it. He's not reading my romance books only because that's not a genre that he's super familiar with. So the woman that's my line editor that catches all my horrible grammatic mistakes, she's doing the developmental pass on it, as just to make sure that everything makes sense and the world is good and that kind of thing. So this will actually be the first series that he hasn't read as one of my editors, which I told him, I said, you're my good luck charm. You have to read it.
So do you think with the middle school there, that is because it's superhero, they were thinking sort of that middle grade thing without thinking about the romance part or the extra part?
Yeah, I think that they were thinking superheroes, and I knew the woman that purchased them for the library where she worked at the middle school. I told her, I said, look, there's swearing, there's some graphic fight scenes, graphic violence. There is a relatively clean love scene in the third book, so there's stuff like that, and she's like, okay, that's fine. And so I'm like, okay, like, I mean, if and it's okay, then great. I told my girls, I was like, when you turn 13, we'll talk about it. But they're reading My Hero Academia now. And so I'm like, well, maybe they, I don't know. Maybe we'll see.
Any feedback from the library saying that, yeah, you were right, we shouldn't have gotten this, or hey, people are loving it and
No,
it's fine, or
no, they had, in fact, it was a couple weeks after I heard that the books were checked out, like they had people waiting for them. So I was like, okay. I mean, and then the pandemic hit, so people really weren't borrowing books at a library like that. So I'm not sure if what exactly happened there, but at the very beginning of it, it was fine. So
you ever thought about going back and or doing another, or well, here you go. There's a series that I read a long time ago. It's called the Left Behind series, and it was adult speculative fiction series, but there was the authors redid it as a teen series. Do you
oh,
ever
okay.
think about taking any of your books, well, let's say just the Serpent's Return, that series, and gearing it down a little bit for a middle grade teen audience?
I actually have a spin-off series in the Vigilantes universe. I have so many book ideas, I'm never going to get around to writing all of them, honestly. But I have it baked in. So the end of this isn't really a spoiler, the end of the first trilogy, the main character decides to start a school for powered kids as a way to protect them, teach them how to use their gifts, that kind of thing. So there is a planned series called the Champions Academy, that's going to be more YA focused, and it's going to be about these young adult, these teen vigilantes who go to this school. So it's very like Xavier's School for the Gifted kind of a thing. And it is definitely going to be geared more YA. The adventure series that I have in mind that I mentioned as a spinoff with one of the characters, Steel, that would be way more, that would be also very accessible to teens in terms of, I think I'm going to tone down a little bit of the violence, some of the swearing. Probably there's not a ton of it, but there's enough swearing in the other trilogies where it does give me pause. But again, I mean, I would say a 15 or 16-year-old could pick up my series if their parents were okay with them. Like, there's no more violence in the books than there are in, let's say, Endgame. There's big fights, there's big smackdowns. It's maybe as dark as like the Michael Keaton Batman movies, so there is those dark elements. But if a teenager is okay with that, then I mean, my trilogy is still accessible, I guess what I'm trying to say. But there are plans to do one that is more YA focused specifically, so that's down the road.
Have you ever thought of resurrecting any of your fan fiction that you wrote as a kid?
No, mainly because those notebooks all got thrown away, but also just there's a ton of Nancy Drew stuff out there. So I don't think the world needs more Nancy Drew fan fiction. But I was, before I started NaNoWriMo in 2015, I had been toying with the idea of writing fan fiction on Archive of Our Own. And I have friends that still write fan fiction, even, they're published authors, but it's kind of like a palate cleanser for them. And I've thought about it. I mean, there's definitely some fandoms that I would love to dip my toe into. But I find that I don't have the time. All my time is taken up with running the business end of indie publishing and then actually writing the books and then family stuff. So it's maybe down the road sometime. I don't know.
Are there any legal implications for writing that or publishing that? Do you need to get certain rights or anything for? I mean, Nancy
For fan
Drew,
fiction?
yeah, for the fan
Oh,
fiction.
well, you can't publish it. You can't make any money
Right.
off of it. I know that certain people get really touchy about fanfic in their worlds. Like J.K. Rowling has gone after fanfic writers, which I don't understand. They're not making any money. They love the world that you've built and they just want to be a part of it. So archive of our own, I think, does protect their authors quite a bit. I haven't really delved into that world as an author, more as a reader. But I do know some authors, more popular authors within very popular fandoms, have gotten pushback from creators, but you cannot make money off of it at all.
So would you just publish?
I
So would you publish then, like throw a few paragraphs in weekly emails or something, or do it as a blog thing on your website? It's so just how would you do it so that it wouldn't
that's
generate money, but you would get that it out your creativity out there?
Yeah, you could. I never even thought of doing that. Actually, like you could, if you have uh, a newsletter and your readers like, let's say, uh, they like Oliver and Felicity. You could give as bonuses your take on Oliver and Felicity as a little fan fiction snippets. You could do it that way. Most people just write it just for the love of it, though. Um, or like I said, I've got some friends that are published authors that in between the books they work on, they'll do a little bit of fan fiction as a palate cleanser. I actually don't know any authors that use it for marketing and content marketing purposes. That's given me an idea. I'm gonna have to think about that. That's a great idea.
Well,
But you're technically not making any money, so I don't think there would be a problem with that. I don't know.
well, any side things that come off of that, royalties, just let me know, and I'll give you my bank account so it can be direct deposited into. Um,
Absolutely.
so let's talk about the technical aspect of your writing now. So you're
Okay.
self-published. You mentioned that
Hmm.
your husband is an editor for part of it, and then you have for the romance stuff, you do have another editor. Um,
Yeah.
let's start with your writing technique. First, are you a pantser? Do you do an outline? Do you use Scrivener? Do you just take notes, computer, notebooks, sticky notes everywhere, napkins when you're out to, well, when you used to go out to dinner? How do
Yeah.
you come up with that story and organize everything?
So I have a notebook for every book, and I start off with just the kernel of an idea, usually a what if question. What if I had a character that was like this? What if this character did that? And I'll just write down those ideas, and it generally, like, I'll then go, okay, well, what would the beginning be like? And I'll try to form a kind of very loose, what's the first plot point, what's the midpoint, what's the third plot point, where are they going to end up, like that. I'll try to figure that out, at least have that much structure. um I've tried to do more outlining, and it's like a deer in headlights. My brain shuts off. So what I generally do is I'll get the general idea and I'll get some bare bones structure. And then I'll just say, okay, I've got enough now to start, and I'll just dive in. And I use Scrivener. I love Scrivener. I don't know how I wrote before Scrivener. Um, I can track things. I can move things around. Like the romance book I'm working on right now, I have two different Scrivener files, and one of it is a mishmash of a bunch of scenes that I wrote. Um, and so all I have to do is drag it over to the Scrivener file that is the actual book, and I just kind of piecing it together like that. um I love Scrivener. Oh my god, I love Scrivener. but when I'm first starting out with the rough draft, or as my husband calls it, and this is very gross, so I apologize, he calls it the vomit draft, but it's such an apt description, because that's what you're doing. You're just bleh, the whole thing, at least for me, onto the computer. I will do 20-minute sprints for the very, very first draft. And so I give myself 20 minutes, usually with other authors online. I'm in a couple of Discord groups, so we'll all sprint together. And I have a word count goal for the day. So I'll do that. And generally speaking, if I stick to my word count goal, I can get a 50 to 60,000 word first draft done in 4 to 6 weeks. Throughout that process, though, I will get to a point where I'm like, okay, something isn't working. What isn't working? And I'll look through the story and I'll say, okay, there's not enough conflict here, or this doesn't make sense. So how am I going to fix it? You know, do I need to change the ending? Do I need to do this? And so I'll brainstorm. And I've tried brainstorming in a separate Scrivener file so I could keep everything together, and it just doesn't work. So I have to use pen and paper for like the brainstorming parts of it, or when I've got the first draft and I'm going to revise, I will make notes. So I don't stop and go back and rewrite. I don't do that. I just get it out. So generally speaking, as I'm getting out that fast draft, I will think of things like, oh, you know what? I actually want to do it like this. So I'm going to need to go back in chapter 3 and I'm going to need to add this, or I'm going to need to change this. And so I get my notebook out and I write it down. And I'll highlight, chapter 3, this character, and then I move on. So by the time the revision time comes around, I have a notebook full of notes that I can refer to. And if I can't get a hold of my notebook for whatever reason, I use the Scrivener scratch pad. So there's a section of Scrivener that you can use, and it's just a scratch pad, and I'll put it there. And then I'll put that in my notebook. So I have a little bit of order. Otherwise, the chaos gets to me. I'm like, I have no idea what I'm supposed to do.
Do you ever
and there always, what?
Go ahead, finish.
There's always a point where it's trash, it's garbage. I can't believe I wrote this. It's never going to work. I'm never going to write a good book again. I don't know what I was thinking. And my husband talks me down off the cliff. And he's like, this happens every time. I'm like, I know you're right. He's like, you will get through this. You'll figure it out. I know you're right. It doesn't feel like that. But then sure enough, a few days or a week later, I figured it out. I move on. And I usually write probably 3 drafts before I turn a draft into an editor. I wish I could speed it up. I really do. But that's my process. I've tried to speed it up a bunch of different ways, and it makes it longer. Like I end up having 4 or 5 drafts. So I have to live in the mess of my drafts and going through and discovering the character development, the deep character development. I've got the surface character development when I start, but like the deeper stuff that really makes a story pop and really makes a story memorable. Those things I tend to discover as I write, and it's messy. And sometimes it doesn't work. And I have to go back and I have to change and rewrite 6 chapters. But it's the mess that works for me. And usually by that 3rd draft, it's popping. I can churn out that 3rd draft in no time. As long as I just respect my instincts and my process, I can turn it around pretty quickly. So
do you ever you're going through your notebook or you're going back, you vomited out the first draft, you've gone back and you're reading through and you're taking notes, oh, I got to do that in chapter 3. So you do the highlighting, but then when you get back to chapter 3 to add this, that, or the other thing, and you're like, no, that's still not going to work. And then you have to go back to the other one and say, okay, how can I change this? Okay, I'm going to go change chapter 5 now. And no, that's still not going to work.
Oh yeah, that Shadow's Torment. Oh my God, I thought that book was going to kill me. I cried. And it's the shortest in the trilogy. It's also the tightest. It is the tightest. Well, I shouldn't say that anymore, because all 3 books got really tight when I rewrote and re-edited them for the relaunch. The plot got a lot more tight, but originally speaking, that book was the tightest, shortest it was really good, but I agonized over it. And that was like 5 or 6 drafts of that book, because exactly what you're talking about. I thought I would fix something and I'd go in, I'm like, nope, it's still screwed up. It still doesn't make, it's still too convoluted. How did I make it like this? And then I have to go back and I have to unravel it. And oh my God. Yeah, that book, I hated that book by the time it was done. I hated it.
So when you went back to revise the other books, and reissue your original trilogy, um, did you find that did you find like shortcuts that
Mm.
um, either you originally wrote into the story because you just couldn't figure out how to end it, so you're just gonna a few lines to kind of finish it, and but then when you went back to reread it again, to re-edit, to reissue it, said, okay, I'm going to write this out a little more, I have a better idea
Mm.
from all my expanded writing, career and everything else I've written, that okay, this will work a lot better, and then you reissued it.
Yes, there was in the first book in particular, I used fight scenes as a way, like if I thought the story was dragging, I was like, well, I'll just put in a fight scene. And that there were too many fight scenes. It was a crutch. And so I went back and not only did I cut out a bunch of fight scenes, but I also shortened the ones that remained, because I realized they really didn't need to be that long. People don't need to see every punch and kick. Much like a sex scene, a fight scene is about emotion. It's about what's going on with the character. How does the character feel? What does the character smell? What do they see? You know, all of those, using all of those senses, that's what a fight scene is. It's not about the technicality of it. And I didn't understand that when I first wrote. And so in going back in that first, like Serpent's Return in particular, it was, I mean, I cut large chunks out where I'm like, I don't even know why I put this in here. This doesn't even make sense. This is dragging things out, and I can tighten it up here. And it's, you know, as you grow as an author, you learn, you see, oh yeah, I don't need to do that, or oh yeah, I can write this better. And I definitely saw that in that first book. And then um that was torment, for all that it tormented me, haha. When I wrote it, it needed the least amount of editing and rewriting. Like I sent it back, I sent it to my new editor to just do another pass on it. And so she found some errors. Um, but that was really about it. And then the third book, Steel's Fate, had the most extensive rewrites, but that was because I was adding a point of view character that really needed to be there. So it was just, in going back, it was a lot of like lessons learned and looking and saying, oh yeah, I do that, and there's the passive voice, and I can get rid of that, and you know, that kind of thing. So it was a really interesting lesson, actually.
So when your husband talked you off the cliff on that, especially on that third book, so just in general, when you get to that point and you're so frustrated, or you've got this writer's block, what are some of the things that you like
Mhm.
to do to um, try to help that? Listen to music, or go for a walk, or we have one that says, you know what, I'm gonna go take a shower, and goes in the shower and just kind of loosens the brain or something, and oh yeah, I know how to work that in. What do you like to do? Drink tea, or
You hit on pretty much all of my stuff. So it is really funny. I will go take a shower. And I'm just sitting there and I'm just, you know, I'm not really thinking about anything. I'm just relaxing. And then it'll, bam, it hits me. I'm like, oh, but I'm in the shower. I don't have a phone. I don't have pencil and paper, and I've got to try to hold it in my brain. So that's a little stressful. But I do find that walking and listening to music is it's like the best therapy. It when I have a block, when I'm not sure what to do, I'll go for a long walk. And we live near water, which for me, for whatever reason, I find very like inspiring and therapeutic all at the same time. And so I'll put my playlist on and I'll let my mind wander. I'll let my mind imagine whatever it wants to imagine, with inspired by the music or what I'm seeing. And eventually my brain will go to the plot problem I'm dealing with. And I'll just kind of like, I'll stress a little bit and I'll try to think of different ways, you know, to fix it. But eventually, at some point during the walk, my mind will stumble onto something. And I'm like, oh, yes, that's great. And what I've taken to doing, because I'm out on a walk, I don't have a notebook, I'll voice dictate an email to myself. And I'll email myself the notes so that I can then put them in my notebook. Um, and sometimes too, this is the really weird one. Um, if I'm cooking dinner, my husband actually cooks more than I do, but back when I was writing the original trilogy, I'd be cooking dinner, he'd be at work, and it would come to me when I'm in the middle of cooking dinner. And so that's when I really started to use voice dictation, is I would voice dictate a note on like either emailing myself, or I'd use like the note app on my
Mhm.
phone. Um, and I would voice dictate what I came up with. And then I could go back later and put that in my notebook. And so I think it's more about like, I have to get away from my desk. I have to get away from the computer and go do something that uses a different part of my brain, for my brain to kind of stumble onto the solution of it.
So have you ever been, well, I'm willing to bet that you're a fan of The Big Bang Theory.
I am not actually.
Really?
I know people are like, no, seriously. I'm like, yeah, never could get into it.
Okay, well, that kind of shoots down my analogy, but well, the
I'm sorry.
character, well, the character Sheldon. There's one episode where he's writing out, trying to figure out some sort of formula, but he's just in the zone. This is what he tells him, not now, in the zone, and he ignores everything.
Mm,
Have you ever been so involved in where you're going? You're just cruising right down. You're writing, and mom, it's time for dinner, or honey, the phone's for you, in the zone.
yep. I have been there actually. My so I have sound canceling headphones now, which was a must when the pandemic hit and we were doing, schooling from home. Um, I used to not like, I have an office now. It's a converted walk-in closet. um, it was a huge walk-in closet. Now, like, just for some context, I'm not in a very tight space, but I used to be out in the front room, and I would be working and they would come up and want help with something, and I would just be in that zone. And I'm like, oh, this is it. That's the word I want to use to describe it. Mom, can you help me with me? And then I
Uh,
lose it and I'm like, oh God, what was it? Um, since I've gotten my own little office space, it happens less because I can close the door and the girls know, I'm gonna knock. And if mommy doesn't answer right away, it's because she's busy. And I'm very honest with them. I'll say, look, mommy has to work and she has to focus, but you're very important. And if you give me a couple of minutes, I will come out and help you. And that's helped a lot. But there are just some times where, like in particularly if I'm sitting there and I'm watching something and I'm like, oh, idea. My husband knows the look now. I'll perk up and I just kind of sit there, and then I shoot off into my office and I'm gone for 10 minutes and I come back and he's like, you got an idea, didn't you? I'm like, yes, I did. I know how to solve that now, or I've got a new story idea. Um, so I've got little, like, I figured out how to have those in the zone moments while also like respecting that my girls also need me sometimes. So it's an interesting work-life balance.
so being a self-published author, what are some of the ways that you come up with the ideas for your book covers? And we mentioned earlier titles. You don't like coming up with titles. How did
Ugh.
you come up with the titles? Somebody else's suggestion based on the reading, or do you take a line out of the book, or well, in this case, it's your characters, isn't it? And your first
Yeah, so the
Vigilantes.
first trilogy focuses on the characters, and that was actually easier than I thought it would be. The second trilogy, not so much. Um, I so the book I just published in August of last year, Fire and Ice. Man, I was sweating that one. I didn't have a title until right before I had to give it to my cover artist. She's like, "What are we calling this?" And I'm like, Fire and Ice. We'll just go with that. Okay. And it works. It worked great. I'm getting better at it as I get better at writing my own blurbs, because you have to do that too as an independent author. And that is a very specific skill set, um, that you have to turn off your writer brain and turn on your marketing publishing brain. And so actually getting better at writing blurbs has helped me to get better at thinking about titles. And because your title is a part of your marketing toolbox. It's a tool that brings in the reader as much as your book cover is. A good title, man, that'll hook people. So I'm getting better at it. I'm getting a little bit more comfortable with it. My romance series, of my cover artist and I, like, we kind of brainstormed it together, which really helped. But I do not design my own covers. That would be very bad. One of the reasons I had to relaunch was because I didn't understand what made a good cover. I did some research, and the original covers for the trilogy are beautiful. Like, they're beautiful works of art. They're moody, they're atmospheric, they're very superhero. They look great on my wall, but they looked terrible on Amazon. You couldn't tell what they were. They were too dark. They were not genre specific. Nobody could look at them and say, oh, that's urban fantasy with some superheroes. Like, you couldn't tell. And I didn't know that's what you needed. So I did new covers with that in mind, but the artwork didn't work. So third time's the charm. I got a different cover artist, who could do the kind of cover art that was on brand for me, having rebranded, but also on point for the genre, which was urban fantasy. And that was it. It looks like an urban fantasy cover. It also looks like superheroes on an urban fantasy cover. It's exactly what I needed. It's the style that sells. It works. And so it's been, in terms of like a learning curve, learning how to ask for the right cover and how to write the right blurb has been a very steep learning curve, but I feel like I'm finally kind of getting there. You also just really need a cover designer that knows how to deliver what you're asking for. And the cover designer I had, he's wonderful at doing pulp covers with airships and spaceships, and he designs the interiors of RPG manuals, and he's a great graphic artist, but he just didn't understand exactly like what I needed for my genre. And I had to go find a cover artist that did. And so it's a matter of finding the right contractor to work with. And that can be difficult. I'm running into that too with audiobooks. I have 2 different narrators I'm working with, but finding those narrators was hard. That was a month each narrator to try to find that right person that could bring my books to life that also wouldn't break my bank.
Are there specific companies that do this, or was it just a matter of a Google search for cover art artist, and then if they work for a company or if they were independent, how did you go about finding?
So
And the same thing for the audiobook voices as well.
So for the cover designer, I work with 2 different ones. I work with one for the urban fantasy series and one for the romance series. And in case of the romance, he's a friend of mine. He's actually my partner in superhero fiction, and we do a podcast together. And he's a graphic designer, but he's also very, very marketing savvy. And he was going to launch his cover business. And he said, if I give you a really cheap rate, can I do test run on your romance series for book covers? And I said, sure. Because if I didn't like him, I didn't have to pay him for them. And I loved them. And now I want to work with him for all my romance covers. But for the urban fantasy one, it was a matter of asking around. And really, that's what word of mouth is, the way that independent authors find editors. We find cover designers, we find print formatters, because a lot of times formatting the interior of your print book is, oh God, I have no problem paying someone to do it, because I would rather pay someone $50 than cry for 2 days straight because I can't figure out what's wrong. So it's a lot of word of mouth. You go into author groups, and we're all very generous with information. Actually, we all love, like, that's the great thing about indie artists or indie authors. We all want to help one another. And so somebody comes in and asks for a recommendation, and they'll get like 50 of them in 15 minutes. So I went and I asked around, and somebody said, hey, I have a cover designer and she's great, and it's her side business, so she's got competitive rates. And I went and I looked at her catalog and I was like, okay, well, you have the style I'm looking for, but this is what I want it to be like. Can you deliver that? And she says, oh yeah, definitely. And she sent me some samples that were similar to what I was looking for. And she was wonderful to work with, absolutely wonderful to work with. And so that's kind of the way it happens. Like you have to take a chance, but you have to be business smart, and you have to say, okay, I want to take a look at it before I pay for it. I don't want to pay you for something that's not gonna work for me. And so, you know, stand your ground, essentially. Like, don't just shovel out a lot of money and then settle for something that looks like crap. Like, be smart about it.
So how has the pandemic affected the way you market first, and then second, how you work with or get or network with other writers?
um
Well, because you mentioned
best,
you used to go to conventions. Did you go to like Comic
yeah,
Cons and things like that?
I did. I was starting to get a good what's the word I'm looking for? I was getting ins with different conventions as a speaker, as a moderator on panels, and also as a panelist. I had done Geek Girl Con in Seattle a couple of years, and I had also, right before the pandemic, the last PAX West convention in Seattle, I had been a speaker on a panel for that. And I was starting to get people asking me to be on panels for Emerald City Comic Con. And I was also planning on doing Norwest Con, or at least trying to get into Norwest Con. And then the pandemic hit. And, so that really kind of torpedo all of that. But I also have friends that do online conventions. So last year I was a part of QuaranCon as a panelist or a moderator, and also Superhero Fiction did our own online convention. It was super small, one panel a day for 5 days, and we're going to be doing that again in June, the 21st through the 25th. But we're expanding it. We're essentially doing 2 panels a day and pre-recorded content, and we're still hammering out all the details of that. But so really during the pandemic, my convention going has gone virtual, which has just been very exciting and very fun. In terms of how it's impacted my business, everything was online anyway, and except for the convention circuits. And so it really hasn't changed anything. I don't, a lot of my author friends are in different states, and so we would chat online anyway, pre-pandemic. The one thing I think it has done is it's made things like this, and conversing through video chats and whatnot, it's made it more prevalent. There's last month I went to 2 virtual pubs where it's basically just authors hanging out and drinking. And one of them lasted for like 8 hours. It was like people just filtering in and out for 8 hours, just chatting. And so my socializing has gotten more online. That has increased, but nothing has really changed like negatively that I can think of.
What about your marketing? As far as marketing books, what are some of the things that you used to do other than cons? Like we have one author who used to go whenever she traveled. She would bring a couple books with her, leave them at the airport with her
Oh,
business card and bookmark in it, and the quick little note and the signature in it.
oh wow,
So
that's cool.
yeah, things like that. Do you do things like that, or and especially with the pandemic
Um,
now, how are you marketing other
yeah,
than these things?
I was starting to try to get into bookstores. I was exploring Ingram Spark and expanded distribution on KDP. Like, kind of, I was just starting to look into it. I hadn't really dipped my toe in it a whole lot when the pandemic did hit. And so it wasn't anything that I had started yet. It's something on my list to circle back around to, but I haven't really done any of that because online was good for me. And now I am looking to expand, and so I'm sure those things will be more on my radar coming up. But it hasn't impacted the marketing so much, honestly.
Ingram Spark is a great way to get yourself into bookstores versus
Yes.
that other one that you mentioned that I'm not going to mention because um, but the KDP there.
Yeah.
But you mentioned the um, audiobooks too. You're starting to work on audiobooks. Libro.fm is the ones that partner with bookstores. Something to
Okay.
look for as well, because we have one author who she put her stuff on Audible, but they had an exclusivity clause or
Hmm.
something where she couldn't go anywhere else on any of the platform until that ran out. And so of course
Hmm.
we can't advertise, promote her audiobook, which we have her physical books in the store and they're
Yeah.
fantastic. So that finally ran out. So she's working now trying to get them on Libro so that we can. So I think maybe one is already her first out of her trilogy is on there, so we can start promoting that. But something to look into.
Yeah.
I did want to mention that I did notice earlier today that you're also going to be, as part of this Pharaoh Feb thing, you're going to be
Yeah.
on this Saturday, the 20th at 3. You're going to be doing an
Yes.
online author panel with the Cary Public Library. I'm not sure where that is, but there's going to be Elle Penelope, Emma Ham, you, and of course H.R. Moore
Hmm.
discussing all the epic fantasy. Um, and she says it's not all about words and swords and dragons, but there is some of that there
That's
too. So
exactly right.
you can go to pharaohfeb.com to register for that. I took part in a panel last week, and it was just fantastic, just hearing all the different views. So we're just about out of time here, so I kind of wanted to finish with we had one or two authors who have such a huge fan base that they actually have fan art sent to them. Do you have any of your fans ever send you some of the art from your art of your characters, your books, or anything like that?
Oh, not yet. I am waiting for the day, honestly, but not yet. No, I have most of the time it's when is the next book coming out? I'm like, I'm working on it, I
Yeah.
promise. But no fan art yet. I do have a friend who also writes superhero romance. In fact, one of her books won a Rita last year, one of the superhero romance books, which was very exciting. But she has candles. She does get fan art, and I'm looking at that. I'm like, I want candles. How do I get candles? So it's on the list. I'm going for it.
There you go. So, final question: who's your favorite cartoon superhero?
Oh, that's a good question. Cartoons. Hmm.
And I have mine, but I like to see, because you said Linda
That's
Carter's one of your favorite
hard.
Wonder Womans because you're from that era. So curious
Yeah.
to see who your favorite cartoon
Well, to
character.
see. Oh man. Well, I
Either
love
growing
the
up or
shows.
now.
Um, you know what? I'm maybe not my favorite, oh, like ever, but for right now, what I'm really into is the Harley Quinn show on HBO Max.
Mm,
So the animated Harley Quinn, I really love her. I was never really a Harley Quinn fan until Margot Robbie and Birds of Prey, and now this animated Harley Quinn show. So for right now, I would say like my animated superhero happy place is Harley Quinn.
okay. Mine is, you may not know this, but the Blue Falcon and Dynamite.
Oh, I've
No?
heard of them.
Okay.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
way back in,
yeah.
actually, I think that was even before I was born, but I watched that was early 70s or so. Um, so anyways,
No, I've got, um, yeah, that's awesome.
there's a whole
I
during
don't know
the
them very
Justice
well, but
League.
I have heard of them.
Well, did you ever watch any like the Justice League or from that Hanna-Barbera
Um,
era?
I watched, yes, like the classic Justice
Yeah.
League, with the with Aquaman.
Yep.
Yes, no, my
Yep.
brothers and I loved that. And we have some of the DVDs. My girls just think it's hilarious. So yeah, we love that, and we also love Young Justice, which is a newer cartoon, and is really good. I highly recommend it if you like DC properties. It's a great
Yep.
one.
Great. Well, Trish, thank you very much. We'll end it there. Everybody, don't forget that Saturday, September 20th, go to pharaohfeb.com to register for that. You can hear her speak again. Maybe hopefully there'll be some new stuff that comes up. It's a great panel. And right now, book 1 is available through her website. Books 2 and 3 are through her website as well, or bookshop.org. And
Mhm.
hopefully soon we'll have all three in at least the first set, and then we'll definitely get some more of the later set. Thank you everybody on Facebook and here for joining us. It'll be the videos available on Facebook if you missed any part of it. And Trish, when we can get out and get around again, if you're ever coming out this way, we'd be more than happy to have you in the store.
I love that. Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Hey, well, thank you very much. Everybody have a good night.